I see those connections being made, it helps me grow in my own faith. If you were not able to be with us last night, I hope you will go back and watch Ragan's presentation on our YouTube channel. He did some readings from his book, a beautifully written book. He will not be able to stay around and sell them, but Denise will be around to sell them, and we'll also put them in the bookstore so that you can buy them for $20 a piece. So if you would like to purchase a book when we're finished, you may hang around and do so. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ragan Sutterfield.
It's so good to be with all of you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So in the little bit of time that I have with you this morning, I want to explore some themes from Scripture about soil. So the book that Evan was just talking about is called The Art of Being a Creature, but its subtitle is Meditations on Humus and Humility. Now, I think that paying attention to soil can teach us important things about what it means to be human and what it means to be creatures. And better yet, how to live into the fullness and flourishing of both those things. Now, paying attention to the soil is something that people who have tried to understand our relationship with the divine have been doing for a very long time. And we find a lot of rich material for that in the very, very beginning of our Bible. Now, there's some debate about this, but the second chapter of Genesis, beginning in the second chapter of Genesis, we find a little bit of a different account of the creation story. So if you remember, Genesis 1 is in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then we go through the days and end with the culmination in the Sabbath. Now, many scholars believe that this is a creation story that was written by a person sometimes called a priestly creation story. And then we find a repetition of the creation story, but it's kind of in this zoomed-in view, where we now find ourselves down with God in the dirt, creating the humus being, the human being from the soil. So I want to look at some passages here that might help us understand our relationship to God and our relationship with the larger creation and how those things interact together. So first of all, as I mentioned, in this second creation story, which many scholars call the Yahwehist story, because they tend to use, this is a program called Accordance, and you'll see down at the very bottom of the screen the Hebrew word. If I hover over it, I can probably pull that up a little bit so y'all can see that better. But the word that is not pronounced in traditional Judaism, that they say Lord, Adonai instead, but it's where we get the word Yahweh, and this is a word that this particular writer uses for God. So in this Yahwehist account, we find that God creates the earth, and there's this particular word that is used for the ground. It says the whole face of the ground. And then it says that the Lord God formed Adam. Now, Adam is the word for human being. It's not just a proper name. It's a general term for human being. So the human being from the Adamah, from the soil. So the human being comes from the Adamah. Now, I had the fortune of getting a grant that allowed me to do some serious study of soil science. And in that course of study, I learned that soil scientists have some very technical terms for different kinds of earthen material. One of those terms is soil, and the other is dirt. Now, those really are technical terms. Now, what dirt is just the inert physical material of the earth. It's the stuff that kind of blows away in the wind. It's ephemeral, and in our Hebrew Bible we find a word that's very similar that often gets translated as dust, afar or apar. There's different ways to transliterate it. And this is the dust, the dry earth, you can see there. And so the ancient Hebrews had a similar designation, this dirt, this ephemeral material. But the soil, what they called the Adamah, is not just inert. It is a living reality. If you take a handful of soil and were to mix it up with some water and put a little drop of that under a microscope, you would see a reality teeming with life. I've done this a few times, and it's always amazing to see what's there right around us. First of all, you would see these little tiny dots moving around, and those are mostly bacteria. And some of them come, and you might see a little soil particle, and they're all around that soil particle, and they've glued themselves to it using this material called glomalin. And in doing that, they're helping actually restructure the soil. And then, if you're looking through the microscope, you might see a little worm-like creature come into view. And that's a nematode. And that nematode comes and it starts to gobble up those little circles. And it's transparent, so you see them inside of its stomach. And then the nematode does what all creatures do. It will poop out those little bacteria. And in doing so, it will release nitrogen into the soil. Then you would see maybe a little filament of mycorrhizal fungi. And that fungi is reaching down into the soil, and it's tapping into the mineral sources in the soil, and it's taking those minerals and it's tapping then into plant roots, and it's starting to create an exchange with those plants. The plants will give the fungi some of the sugars that they're producing from sunlight, and the fungi in return will give the plant some of the micronutrients that the plant needs for growth. Now, all of that is happening in just a tablespoon of soil, and it's this incredible life-giving reality. Now, the ancient Hebrew people did not have microscopes, and so they couldn't see all of these relationships. But they did know that there were certain kinds of soil that gave life. And so they named that soil the Adamah. It's what we might call humus soil. And it's from that soil that they say the human being comes. But the human being is also related to the dirt. So we kind of stand between soil and dirt. And I think that one way to understand this is that it is our relationship with the force of life that comes from God, the breath of life, that makes that difference, whether we are on the side of dirt or whether we are on the side of soil in our relationships. It's really fascinating, but part of my study of soil microbiology with a pioneering soil scientist named Elaine Ingham, she really emphasizes that most of the good soil microbes that help us live into and have the kind of flourishing soil that will produce good plants and produce life, those are aerobic microbes, meaning they breathe air. Now, they're important anaerobic microbes too, but I think that that's just an interesting relationship, especially as we think about the breath of God being the thing that sustains life in all creatures. So soil and dirt, afar and Adamah. Now, as we know, the human beings were put into the garden, and they were given a particular vocation. So I want to look at Genesis 2:15 for a moment and look at some of the relationships that are there. Now, the first word that can be helpful for us in understanding the human relationship with the whole of creation is just the simple little word, put. It's from this Hebrew word, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I did Greek in seminary, so forgive me if you are and I'm mispronouncing anything, but this yanak or yanik is the root word for this term put. There's a scholar named Kristen Stewart who says that there's a sense in this word of a gentle placing, a kind of resting. So it's not like God just took the human being and just dropped him into the garden. It's instead that the human being is gently placed. And Stewart says that there's almost this sense of Sabbath in that relationship, that the placement of the human being is to be in this kind of, in the work that the human being is being called into is a kind of continuation of this Sabbath life that God has already infused creation with. So the human being is put into the garden and given two specific tasks: to till it and to keep it. Now, anyone who has spent some time studying soil knows that the worst thing you can do is till it. Tilling is deeply destructive to the soil. It's kind of like a hurricane coming through that soil microbial community. Now, there are, of course, times when it's necessary, but more and more farmers are turning to no-till methods that utilize the existing soil structure and build up organic matter and try to preserve that community of life that's in the soil. So no-till is the way that a lot of our work is going in working with the soil. Thankfully, there are other possibilities for this word till in the Hebrew language. This word avad could mean till, but it's also, and it's used in this way more often in the Hebrew scriptures, to serve. So it could be to serve the soil. And you can see this here, to work, to till, but also to serve. And so I think it's important for us to take that as a way of disciplining our understanding of the human vocation, that we are not only placed in the garden to till it, to extract some value from it, but instead to serve it. The other side of this vocation is to keep it. Now, what is keeping? What does keeping mean? As you can see, one of the other possibilities for translating this word is to preserve it, to maintain the integrity of creation. There's a wonderful Anglican document called the 5 Marks of Mission that was an attempt by the Worldwide Anglican Communion to think about what marks Anglican mission in the world. In the 5th mark of mission, they talk about the call to safeguard the integrity of creation. And I like that language because as we learn about ecology, there is this interaction and wholeness of all of the different parts working together. And so it's this wholeness that needs to be integrated together and kept in that way. And so that, I think, is the second part of our vocation. So whatever translation you read this in, this is the NRSV, which is what we usually use. I think that's probably what y'all use at St. Paul's. But whenever you read this, I want you to now think about that call is to serve and preserve the creation. Now, as we know, things did not work out. The service and preservation of the creation was not where this story ended. And so God, when God finds the human being in rebellion and seeking some power beyond the limits that God has given them, that there is a kind of punishment that is a result of this. And so we find this a little bit later in the chapter. So, but there's some important things here as well. So I've been thinking a lot about weeds. There's a wonderful book by a permaculturalist, and permaculture is just a discipline of thinking about how we grow things that works towards an integration and wholeness, and tries to imitate natural systems. And in this, part of what we do is we pay attention to what's happening in the soil. A plant isn't just a plant, it's a sign of something that's going on. So for instance, many types of weeds will grow in areas where there's a deficiency that they can fill. Certain plants that, for instance, pigweed is a major problem for a lot of farmers in Arkansas. Palmer amaranth is the more proper name for this weed, and it grows really fast. It grows so fast that it can overwhelm a field full of soybeans in no time and completely destroy tens of thousands of dollars of a crop. It's a native plant to Arkansas, and some of its relatives were used by indigenous people farther south to pop that you could take the seeds and pop them like popcorn. Its leaves are more nutritious than spinach, but it's considered something that we do not want in our fields. Now, why is Palmer amaranth such a big problem for farmers in Arkansas? Part of it is Palmer amaranth moves in when the soil is disturbed. When the soil is disturbed, Palmer amaranth comes in and it has a very deep taproot. It grows very quickly. And what it's doing is it's moving in to start the work of healing the soil. It's working to hold on to the soil, to keep it from eroding, and it's trying to break up that soil, and it's also beginning the process of adding organic matter back into the soil. I think about Palmer amaranth when I think about this early punishment that God tells to Adam, that from the ground, the Adamah, because of you, now the ground's going to create toil, and that thorns and thistles will begin to come from that ground. What if thorns and thistles are working not as a punishment, but in cooperation with God as a protection against the kinds of abuse that God knows that the human being is going to mete out on creation, especially as we leave behind that call to till and keep the soil. You'll see a little bit later on in Genesis, in this early Genesis story, it says that the Adam began to till the soil, but that keeping is taken away. That's no longer part of what Adam is doing with the soil. So what are we to do instead? What lessons can we learn from this that can help us live in a different way? Well, in Arkansas, there are actually two brothers who are really pioneers known across the nation for the ways in which they are dealing with Palmer amaranth. they almost went bankrupt because they had spent so much money on herbicide to deal with the problem of palmer amaranth in their fields. They were spending nearly $1 million a year on herbicides. They have thousands of acres that they're dealing with. And what they did in order to counteract this, they were so desperate, they started using no-till methods in their farming, and they started to plant cover crops, and they started to pay attention to soil health. And in doing so, they found that palmer amaranth wasn't the problem that it used to be, because there was no more emergency that palmer amaranth was coming in to solve. And they have had a great success, and they've started the Arkansas Soil Health Association and are working to help other farmers come on board. Farming is a very conservative industry. You don't want to mess with anything because the margins are so thin. But when somebody like that is in a desperate place, they can sometimes find a different way. So they're learning to listen to those thorns and thistles and to respond appropriately. So I said that there is a way in which the ground cooperates with God. Now, we know that the first real tragedy after the fall itself is in the tragic murder of Abel by Cain. Now, a lot of this is just supposition on my part, but I do think that there's some interesting work at play here. First of all, Abel was a keeper of the sheep, while Cain is a tiller of the ground. Now, I wonder if this tiller of the ground part is not in some way drawing on that violent possibility of that word, of his tilling of the ground being the first way in which Cain was involved in a kind of murderous work. Abel, on the other hand, was a keeper of sheep. Sheep were the first animals that were domesticated, as far as we know, and they can be kept in thinner soils in such a way that actually keeps the soil in place. And so that's something that I wonder about. Now, as we know, God rejects Cain's offering and accepts Abel, and it makes Cain filled with a kind of murderous rage. Now, how does God know about this? God knows about Abel's murder because the ground tells him. We see here that the Lord God says, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, from the Adamah, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth." This archetypal story from our scriptures is really important for understanding the way in which I think the earth can work with God to sometimes counter human action. There's a wonderful scholar named Mari Jorstad, and she's a Canadian biblical scholar. If any of you know Ellen Davis, she's an Episcopal Old Testament scholar, and Mari Jorstad was one of her graduate students. But Mari Jorstad has written this wonderful book called The Hebrew Bible and Environmental Ethics. And in it, she says that if you look at the Hebrew Bible, you don't find a world of just inert material creation with human beings being the only sentient part of it. Instead, you find a kind of animistic understanding that the world has agency and speaks. Sometimes rocks are called on to bear witness. Sometimes trees bear witness and act. And in this story, the soil itself cries out. And she does a wonderful job of just walking through the whole Hebrew Bible and exploring all of these passages. But I think that in this story, we can find the ground working as an agent of God in cooperation with God to work against Cain's own abuse of the soil. Now, it's interesting that Cain is someone who rejects the curse that God gives to Cain. So we see here that God says, when you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and wander on the earth. Cain's very upset by this. But by the end of the story, we find Cain settling in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So he's cursed to be a wanderer, but instead Cain settles. And shortly after this, Cain conceives a son and builds a city and names it Enoch after his son. Now, this term Enoch has some connotation of wandering. So he actually names the city Wandering, but that's where he settles. Now, there's a great French sociologist named Jacques Ellul. And Jacques Ellul wrote a book called The Meaning of the City. And he thinks that the Bible is telling us something by saying that the very first city ever founded was founded by Cain. So what are cities about? In their worst way, cities are about creating places of human projects rather than simply living with and accepting the gifts that God offers us. That difference between project and gift is something that I think we find run up against one another all the time. God continually offers us gifts, but we tend to then turn them into projects. And the city is a place where those projects get played out. Now, I don't think that this means that all cities are bad. I live in a city, but Ellul says that our understanding that the city has this kind of dark root to it is important for the work of redeeming the city. Now, I'm not going to pull up the passage here, but there is, I think, a tremendous work at play that if we go all the way to the very end of our scriptures, with the book of Revelation, that it ends with a garden city. And in this way, we see the beautiful work that God is doing in taking this fallenness, where human greed and vengeance and murderous desires that all worked together to create this enterprise. And we see this happen in Babel and many times over in the Hebrew Bible. But takes this enterprise of a city and turns it back into a garden. And I think that's a wonderful sign of the kind of redemptive work that God is doing. So what are we to do with all of this? I know my time's almost up here, but I think our call is to begin that work of turning our cities or any of our human places into places where we can accept the gifts of God and celebrate them. We can move our cities into places that are garden-like and welcome the whole of creation that we saw at play in that story in the Garden of Eden. So practically, how do we begin to do that? Well, one of the parts that I skipped over in the early part of Genesis 2 is that after the initial vocation is given to the Adam, the next thing that he does is begins to name the animals. Naming is a really important thing because it helps us live into relationship with things. Evan and I were standing outside the church a little bit ago, and we were talking about the different kinds of birds that Evan's seen here and the different trees that are outside of St. Paul's. And just beginning to name that, we start to understand and be in relationship with these creatures. So that's a beginning point. But then, once we begin to name things, we can begin to understand how to create a place of hospitality for them, which is really what a garden is. There's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend, this might be a good book study for y'all at St. Paul's. We did a study of it at Christ Church, and it's called Nature's Best Hope. And it's by an entomologist named Douglas Tallamy. And what he's advocating is what he calls homegrown national park. And the idea is that anyone who has a little bit of land can start to work to create and plant habitats. Could just be planting an oak tree, because oak trees host hundreds of different species of caterpillars in their leaves. And so Tallamy says that if we start to plant more of these kinds of native plants that support all kinds of insects, then those insects will then support all kinds of birds and then on through the ecosystem. And we can begin to do the work of creating a kind of garden city. If you see some place where this is being played out, I was in Indianapolis, and I just walking downtown Indianapolis, and there are all these manicured lawns and big parks, just Bermuda grass, which is essentially an ecological desert. But then I came to this little place just outside of Cummins Diesel, the engineering firm that makes those engines, and they have turned their entire campus around their building into a prairie. And so it's all of these wild species, and there's so much life just right there in downtown Indianapolis. But that's something that all of us can do in little ways, even if we just have a little patch of grass, or in larger ways with a larger campus. So working towards that garden city is a way that we can fulfill that original vocation that God gave to the soil creature, the Adam from the Adamah, to serve the creation and to preserve it. Thank you.
Let's say thank you to Ragan. Again, I'm so grateful that Ragan is with us, and he's not far away. And so when he says things like, what about a book study for Nature's Best Hope? Ragan's a friend, and we're in a relationship. So I trust that this conversation, which is really a continuation, can continue to unfold. So I hope that we will continue to reflect on these things and perhaps reach out to Ragan and ask some questions for him again. Thank you so much for being with us. Don't forget to purchase a book if you would like one. After today, we'll move them to the bookstore. Next week, we'll be back with our series on anxiety, and I hope to see you then. Thanks so much.